we will move on the agenda to item H, public comment. This is portion of the agenda is dedicated to hearing comments from the public on the Gelman cleanup and the proposed fourth amended consent judgment. As most of you know, the former Gelman site on Wagner Road is contaminated with 1,4-dioxane, and the plume of the 1,4-dioxane has migrated to the east and to the west of the site. The Circuit Court in Washtenaw County entered a consent judgment in 1992, which imposed cleanup obligations on Gelman. That consent judgment was amended in 1996, 2005, and again in 2011. Several years ago, the consent judgment was opened once again, and Scio Township joined with Washtenaw County, the Washtenaw County Health Department, the City of Ann Arbor, and the Huron River Watershed Council to intervene in the legal process. Our goal was to develop a revised consent judgment that will govern the continued cleanup of the Gelman site. Until now, the process of revising the consent judgment was subject to a confidentiality order entered by the court that is overseeing this legal process. The confidentiality order prohibited us from disclosing any information about the negotiations. On Monday, August 31st, 2020, Washtenaw County Trial Court Judge Timothy Connors partially lifted the confidentiality order. As a result, the following documents have been made public for your review and comment. 7 short videos providing summary explanations of the proposed settlement. A proposed fourth amended consent judgment with attachments. A proposed order of dismissal. Proposed settlement agreements. A summary and chart that identify and show the key differences between the current third amended consent judgment and the proposed fourth amended consent judgment, and a red line comparison of the fourth amended consent judgment against the existing third amended consent judgment. If you haven't yet reviewed them, these documents are available via an online repository developed by the intervening parties. The repository is available through a link on the Scio Township website. At this time, all documents are proposed and have not yet been approved by Scio Township or the other interveners. We will review these proposed documents and consider all comments submitted directly to us, comments made by the public at this meeting, and comments made at meetings held by the other interveners before making our decision. Other interveners will hold their own public comment sessions that have or will be announced by their respective local governments. The Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners and Congresswoman Debbie Dingell will host a public hearing and question and answer session on Thursday, September 24th via Zoom. The interveners expert, Dr. Larry Lemke, as well as legal counsel, will be present to answer the many questions you have submitted and any questions raised this evening. Our purpose tonight is to hear your comments and to provide answers through the legal and technical experts on Thursday's evening. We will not be answering questions and will not engage in dialogue tonight. We will forward new questions received tonight to the county for possible response at the meeting on Thursday. We will first start with a presentation by Dan Bicknell, followed by a presentation by Roger Rail. Then we will open it up for comments by others. If you have joined by telephone, again, please use by computer, please use the raise hand feature, and if by telephone, use your *9 feature. As with the public comment section on the agenda, everyone will have one opportunity to address the board with a 5-minute time limit. Please give your name prior to speaking. Dan?
Well, thank you very much, Jack. Maybe what we could do is go through the Global Environment Alliance review that I had provided you all earlier today. Just to talk a little bit, as Jack did, about the consent judgment intervention. It had started back in 2016 with the city and county petitioning to intervene in the existing third amended consent judgment, and negotiations after they received status continued through 2018, 19, and 20. And currently, as Jack indicated, we have a fourth proposed amendment to look at. The overview here that GEA did shows that the proposed Fourth Amendment consent judgment is really a continuation of the current consent judgment dilution remedy off the former Gelman site. And it's not going to stop the dioxin plume from expanding towards Scio Township, Ann Arbor Charter Township, drinking water wells, or Barton Pond. And therefore, it's not really protective of public health and the environment. In the eastern area, and the site is divided, as we'll talk about, into eastern area east of Wagner Road and the western area west of Wagner Road. It allows Gelman or Eagle to expand the prohibition zone through institutional controls and land use restrictions if the data indicates that the drinking water criteria 7.2 may be beyond the existing boundary. And this, of course, includes Scio Township property east of Wagner Road. The proposed Fourth Amendment to the consent judgment has the groundwater surface water interface definition allow Gelman to apply a mixing zone-based GSI instead of hitting the 280 parts per billion generic value. And again, we'll talk about that. But this mixing zone-based GSI will develop a higher, much higher, vastly higher value than 280 as a compliance requirement. The mandatory extraction wells that they're going to have off the site, which are mostly the current extraction wells, but except for one, are not going to stop the dioxin groundwater contamination from spreading. All of the 2020 active extraction wells that are pumping right now have an average of 463 gallons per minute, whereas all of the Fourth Amendment consent judgment extraction wells, including the Park Lake well, which may not be installed, have an operation maximum of 475 gallons per minute. So right now, they're pumping at 463 gallons per minute, and with this new consent judgment, it's going to be 475. So it's no material difference. And the state's indicating that there is going to be substantially more groundwater collected in this Fourth Amendment consent judgment. There are prohibition zone containment objectives which must be met by Gelman and can be met by Gelman or Eagle by simply expanding the prohibition zone boundary. There is a GSI, a groundwater surface water interface objective, and that can again be attained by applying a mixing zone-based GSI. Therefore, the requirements to terminate these extraction wells in the eastern area, except for the Park Lake well, can be easily met by Gelman. The prohibition zone expansion provision in the CJ, the implementation of institutional controls and land use restriction provision, and the municipal water connection contingency plan provision all work together to allow Gelman to expand the prohibition zone, place institutional controls on private landowners, and provide the landowner with an alternate water supply. All of that is able to be done instead of real active remediation to stop the plume. There is an option for a Park Lake extraction well, but it has conditions, and the conditions are that it be allowed to discharge into the first sister lake, which is a city nature preserve, and that the well will obtain a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit to allow this discharge, and it can be no more stringent than what Gelman currently has for their central treatment plant. Both of these are significant preconditions for actually installing that well. There are no Sentinel Wells across M14 by Elizabeth Road, which are needed to protect the most at-risk Scio Township residential areas along Elizabeth Road, Rose Drive. At the former Gelman site, they are, though, going to do some limited actions, which is positive. They're going to install 3 additional wells and maybe 3 more conditionally. They're going to do phytoremediation, which I generally in the business call tree mediation, but it's phytoremediation. They're going to plant some trees, in other words, in the former Pond 1 and 2 areas, as well as the marshy area. And they are going to do some soil vapor extraction through a heated mechanism in the former burn pit. But overall, on balance, the current third amended consent judgment, with a simple updating of the definitions to the current Eagle drinking water and groundwater surface water interface criteria, would be more protective of public health and the environment than the proposed Fourth Amendment, because it requires now that Gelman do many of these things that, as you'll see, they may be slipping away from. I think we all know the Gelman site background pretty well here. What has happened in the consent judgment is there is a division between the eastern and western areas based on Wagner Road. So as we go through the consent judgment, you'll see things that are based on the eastern area and things that are based on the western area. And I'll talk first, please, in this review about the eastern area and then the western area. In this revised consent judgment, they expand the prohibition zone again. The original prohibition zone was the red line. It was expanded in 2011 to the expanded prohibition zone to encompass the evergreen area because the plume expanded from the original boundary, despite what the state said it wouldn't, into the evergreen area. And now there's this proposed Fourth Amendment boundary, and that's based on generally where they believe the dioxane is at 7.2, the new drinking water criteria. The old ones were based on where it was at 85 parts per billion drinking water criteria. In this document here, it allows Gelman or Eagle to expand the prohibition zone boundary if the groundwater contamination at 7.2, as it's defined, in other words, the drinking water criteria, may be beyond the prohibition zone. And this is very important because it allows either Gelman or Eagle to expand it if they think that the groundwater may be contaminated above the drinking water criteria. So this is a provision for the continued expansion of the prohibition zone, which is a main objective of this consent judgment. Additionally, in the western area, they allow the continued migration of the groundwater contamination into the prohibition zone, and they even say that it should not be considered should not be considered as expansion and is allowed. Really, there's no hydraulic control that is stopping this. The strategy is to allow and continue with this dilution remedy. And there's an illustration in the consent judgment dealing with this triangle piece of property. They say that if the triangle piece of property becomes contaminated above the drinking water criteria, then it can become part of the prohibition zone. But what the CJ does not say, it doesn't require Gelman to halt the dioxane plume from moving into this triangle property above the drinking water criteria. And here's the triangle property. It's right on the other side of M14. It's within the township. The settlement agreement, which is a part and parcel of the package that Gelman is proposing as a take or leave it proposition, also has the township saying that it will support the implementation of institutional controls. In other words, they are asking, and this agreement, if you sign it, is saying that you're going to support the taking of private property from residents if their well becomes contaminated. There are two components of the eastern area objectives. There's the prohibition zone containment objective, and then, as we'll see in a second, there's the groundwater surface water interface objective. And the prohibition zone says that the defendant shall not allow, or shall prevent rather, the groundwater contamination from migrating beyond the boundaries of the prohibition zone, except as allowed in section 5A2F, which we saw previously says that if the contamination is above 7.2, the drinking water criteria, then either Gelman or Eagle can expand the prohibition zone. So they have a very broad exception here to allow the prohibition zone containment objective to be attained by expanding the prohibition zone. The groundwater surface water interface objective is to prevent the dioxin from venting into the surface waters. In other words, the Huron River. But there's an exception to this one as well, except in compliance with Part 201, 324, 2120E in the MCL. As you see here, there is an illustration of what the groundwater surface water interface means. This is where the groundwater and the surface water meet. That's the groundwater surface water interface, and that's what it's trying to regulate. It's trying to protect the river from the groundwater contamination getting into it. And where these two mix, it's called a mixing zone area. And in the eastern area, again, they have this exception of you can follow 324, 2120E. Well, what that really does is it allows them to apply a mixing zone. It allows them to get a dilution of what is going into the river to back calculate what is necessary to be protected. So this resulting mixing zone based GSI is going to be much greater than the generic GSI of 280. The generic GSI does not consider a mixing zone. And Eagle has made numerous statements in the public that actually is going to require Gelman to clean up to this generalized 280 value. But here is the exception that they sneak in, as I'll call it. It's the 2120E section. Everybody in the area in the business is familiar with this. It allows the venting of groundwater into surface water. And it says a person may demonstrate compliance for venting groundwater by meeting any of the following or in combination, and there it is right there, a mixing zone-based groundwater surface water interface criteria. Additionally, under another section within this, another area within this section, Gelman can do an evaluation, and if they can demonstrate that the venting of the groundwater, the dioxin plume, will have no effect or a de minimis effect, then they're done. So they have two options. They can use the mixing zone based, or they can just make a de minimis claim. What we have, and we'll talk a little bit about the plume migration here for a bit, and the wells that they intend to put in, is the CJ establishes locations and pumping rates for groundwater extraction wells. And they have lumped a number of wells together, which they call the Evergreen Wells, the Maple Road Wells, and the singular Park Lake Well. Collectively, the Evergreen and Maple Road wells are to collect 200 gallons per minute. And the Park Lake Well is to collect 200 gallons per minute as well. But again, with the Park Lake Well, it requires that they receive a very favorable NPDES permit and that they are allowed to contaminate a wetland in a city nature preserve, which is very dubious they're going to be able to accomplish that. If you look at the data, the existing groundwater extraction wells that are in the Evergreen and Maple Road area already collect 181 gallons per minute. And remember that this consent judgment says that all of the Evergreen and Maple wells are supposed to collect 200 gallons per minute. So right now, they're pretty much at what is required, but they're going to add a well. They're going to add a rose well to collect dioxin plume at a high concentration area. But if they do that, and it's within the Evergreen area, that well, which is destined to try to stop the highest plume concentrations from moving, is only going to be able to pump 19 gallons per minute. And if not, then they're going to have to governor back the other wells. So there are limitations here on what they're saying they're going to do versus what is reality and what's being done today. And that goes for all of the wells. If you look at all of the operating extraction wells on and off the Gelman property, today they're collecting, as an average in 2020, for the first 3 months, 463 gallons per minute. But if you follow what the consent judgment says, that on and off the property, including the Park Lake well, they only have to collect 475 gallons per minute. So there's no substantive difference between what they're doing today under the third consent judgment, whereas what they would have to do under the fourth. Essentially, it's a 2.4% increase. And that's if the Park Lake well at 200 gallons per minute is operating, which is not likely. If you take the Park Lake well out, their total in the consent judgment is 275 gallons per minute, whereas today they're pumping 463. So in summary, there's really not enough groundwater extraction wells, and they're not pumping at a level that's going to make a difference. And the sad part here in all of this is that when they were designing these fourth amended CJ wells, the number of wells and the rate, they used what Gelman has. They used the existing 200 gallon per minute transmission line to base on how many wells and what would be the rate that they could extract from. And that's just not the proper way to design a groundwater remedial system. The proper way is to do a remedial design investigation where you look at how many wells you really need and what their pumping rates are to capture and control a plume. And that's not what they have done, nor are they proposing to do it. Here's an illustration of the plume. Here's where the evergreen wells are. Here's where the rose wells are. And here's where the Maple Road wells are. Here's the Park Lake well, and here's the wells that they are going to put on the property. So in this area, if they're going to have the Rose well do anything above the 18 gallons per minute, they're going to have to attain the overall 200 gallons per minute. They're going to have to cut back in these other wells. Moreover, if you look at where the plume is now, the plume is already beyond these extraction wells, and it's going to continue to migrate freely towards, of course, Ann Arbor Charter Township, the city, and you all in Scio Township. Quick thing on the Park Lake well, it is supposed to be extracting about 200 gallons per minute, and it's going to be discharging into this First Sister Lake, which is a wetland nature preserve as deemed by the city. However, if they were to, and the well will be about in this area where my pointer is. However, if they were to, instead of discharging in the First Sister Lake, run a pipe over to the Gelman property, which is about 2,600 feet, it would cost only $350,000 to do that. So really, they're, in this consent judgment, going to be adversely impacting a wetland nature preserve to save what Gelman should view as a reasonable cleanup cost. What they've done here is they've taken away in this amended fourth consent judgment a very important item, that is that they took away the Maple Road containment objective, which stops the groundwater from moving east of Maple Road. Here's Maple Road. If they had simply replaced the old groundwater surface water interface value of 2,800, which was required underneath the Maple Road containment objective not to go past Maple Road, with the 280 part per billion updated groundwater surface water interface value, they actually would have had to clean up all of this area. So by taking away the Maple Road containment objective in this revised consent judgment, they allowed Gelman to get away with not dealing with this 280 part per billion plume. Now it's allowed to move through the city of Ann Arbor. But don't feel left out, because they also took away the Little Lake area containment objective, which included this Ann Arbor cleaning supply well here. Here is the Scio Township residential wells. Here's the plume. The objective of this well was to halt the migration towards your residential wells. They took that away. There's no requirement now to operate that Ann Arbor cleaning supply well. As you all know, here are your residential areas. Here is the plume. Here's Elizabeth Road, where you've had contamination and currently have contamination of residential wells. The areas additionally that are of concern, though, are the lower topographic areas. In this area here, this is the Honey Creek tributary, a Honey Creek tributary And here's another Honey Creek tributary, and the area 1 is by Elizabeth Road, and area 2 more or less goes down in this area here. As we'll see, here's the plume, here's the area 1 of concern, and here's the ravine, again, going down towards the Maple Road area and towards Scio Hills. And again, this is the DuPont area, and here's their high concentrations. GEA did a vector analysis that showed, based on the monitoring well elevations, that this area here where the DuPont well is moving towards Elizabeth Road, and that's why there's contamination there, as well as Rose. And Eagle has stated that, yes, the plume is moving towards this northwest area, towards Rose Drive. What you really need here is to have Sentinel Wells, and the objective of Sentinel Wells here in the consent judgment is to ensure that any potential migration of groundwater contamination outside the prohibition zone is detected before the migration occurs, to also track the migration of the groundwater contamination. Well, here we have where the wells are. This is a Sentinel well, there's a Sentinel well, here's a Sentinel well, another Sentinel well, and another Sentinel well. But you notice in this area, which is at the highest risk, they do not have a Sentinel well. Yet the distance between these two Sentinel wells is about a little over a half a mile. So it's GEA's view that you need a Sentinel well on the other side of M14 in this Elizabeth Road area and down gradient area to really understand where the plume is moving. As part of this companion piece that they've put together, they have a municipal water connection contingency plan. And what that says that is if a private owner has a drinking water well that becomes contaminated above the drinking water criteria, it is allowed to have a municipal water connection. And these plans are brought up and looked at, and I think it's very positive. And they include, of course, Elizabeth Road, as we've talked about, but they also include Kelvin Street, Wagner Road, and Lakeview. As part of the work, though, that these municipal water connection contingency plans perform is they really allow the plume to expand and then have the property owner receive municipal water versus stopping the plume from expanding and therefore allowing the property owner to continue to use their well. They have in the eastern area a good requirement, a remedial contingency plan, that if one of these Sentinel well triggers shows that the plume is moving off and it could be of concern, that they need to do something. However, it is expressly stated here, and I've underlined it, that the remedial contingency plan may identify expansion of the prohibition zone as an option, okay, subject to section 5A2F, which we saw 5A2F means that either Gelman or Eagle can expand the prohibition zone if it's going to be over the drinking water criteria. So one of their remedial contingency plans that they have, if the groundwater is flowing and it's contaminating an area and it looks like it may contaminate a well, they can just expand the prohibition zone underneath this, quote, remedial contingency plan. The western area has an objective, and it's to prevent the horizontal migration of contamination regardless of depth from expanding, which is very positive in this western area, which we'll talk about for a little bit. There's a western area non-expansion cleanup criteria, and it says that it will allow a response activity to be generated if, again, it looks like there's going to be an expansion beyond the existing drinking water criteria. But this response activity is defined in MCL 2010 as also including the providing of an alternate water supply. And it's really not clear on how they're going to use an alternate water supply to attain compliance in this objective, the Western Area Non-Expansion Cleanup Objective, to prevent the expansion of the groundwater contamination. What you see here is the pieces being put together. And what they show is if you put the Prohibition Zone expansion provision, the implementation of the institutional control and land use restriction provision, and the municipal water connection contingency provision all together, it simply allows Gelman or Eagle to expand the Prohibition Zone, place institutional controls on a private landowner whose drinking water well becomes contaminated above the drinking water criteria, and provide the homeowner with a municipal water supply. It doesn't, again, cut off the performance, sorry, it doesn't stop the migration of this groundwater pollution towards the owner so that they can safely drink their well. Rather, it allows the taking of private property. As you know, the federal government has a different approach. Under Superfund, they would really halt the plume migration, regardless of if it's in a prohibition zone or not. If we look at some termination criteria, because this is all about Gelman wants to try to get out of this. We talked about in the eastern area, they have the prohibition zone, containment objective, and the groundwater surface water interface objective, which they must meet. If they meet these two objectives, they're done with the eastern area. As we saw, though, that in the eastern area, they also have the Evergreen and Maple Roads, but they're operating until the eastern area objective can be met. Same thing with the Wagner Road. The exception is the Park Lake extraction well, which may not even be installed by Gelman. So as we're discussing, if you look at attaining the Prohibition Zone containment objective, it can be met by Gelman or Eagle just by expanding their Prohibition Zone boundaries, which they have the right to in this amended consent judgment. And the groundwater surface water interface objective, that can be met by applying a mixing zone based GSI. Therefore, the requirements to terminate the extraction wells in the eastern area, except for Park Lake, can be met fairly easily by Gelman. In the western area, again, you talk about the western area and they're supposed to prevent it, but it's again unclear as exactly what the closure criteria are going to be for this thing. They have the same closure criteria, though, for the groundwater surface water interface and the same exception in the western area that they can apply a mixing zone based criteria. If we look at the Gelman property, which is the positive part of this, limited as it is, but positive, they indicate that they're going to prevent the migration of the 1,4-dioxane from contaminated soils, okay? Notice the focus is on contaminated soils, okay, on the Gelman property, from getting into the aquifer at concentrations or locations that may cause problems, may cause non-compliance. So this Gelman property response activities deals solely with soils as it's defined. What they do, though, however, is they do have 3 additional extraction wells, despite what they talk about in their objectives, with an option for 3 more. And they're required to be operating at a combined rate of 75 gallons per minute. And their termination criteria is 500 parts per billion dioxane. As we talked about in the summary, they're going to do phytoremediation at pond 1 and 2. And they're also going to do phytoremediation in the marsh area. And this is to reduce the mass of the dioxane. There's no specific criteria, numeric criteria for them to start or stop. They just need to reduce the mass, which is rather subjective. In the former burn pit area, they're going to do the heated soil vapor extraction. And that is, again, to draw the dioxane mass out of the soil. More or less what that does is it vaporizes the dioxane to bring it out, and then they collect it. This, again, Fourth Amendment consent judgment works in tandem with the settlement agreements that they're also asking you all to concur with and sign on with. And the main provisions here are dismissal of the intervention. In other words, we've been talking about in the consent judgment where it's between Gelman and Eagle. They're asking you, if you sign the settlement agreement, to drop out of anything further with the consent judgment, even though you spent $400,000 in a year in circuit, appellate, and Supreme Courts to get that status. They're asking for a full release of your claims, future and past. They're asking you to help impact that wetland and get an NPDES permit for the Park Lake well. And they're asking you to drop all support for Superfund. They're asking you to specifically rescind your prior resolution that you had in 2016 supporting the designation of the Gelman site as a Superfund site. And I think this clearly demonstrates that Gelman prefers this state consent judgment over that action which would be required under a federal Superfund administrative order, despite what some people may have said. This clearly supports that they do not want to go Superfund, and they're very afraid of it, rightfully so. So in summary, there's a migration of the dioxin plume in the northwest, eastern, and southern areas. And the fourth amended consent judgment really doesn't change this. It's still a dilution remedy. It's not going to stop the plume from expanding into your township or Ann Arbor Township or travel through the city. It's going to allow Gelman to increase the prohibition zone if the dioxin is above 7.2. It's going to allow them to have a groundwater surface water interface criteria that is not the 280, which we've been promised, but it's going to be much, much higher, probably even higher than the 2,800 in the past. The total amount of groundwater extracted in the fourth consent judgment is 475 gallons per minute with the Park Lake well, which might not be installed, whereas currently they're pumping 463 gallons per minute. So real no substantive benefit there. And the option for the Park Lake well is really dubious, given that they have to get a very favorable NPDES permit, and they have to allow the city nature preserve to be impacted. Again, the prohibition zone containment objectives can be met easily by Gelman, and therefore they can terminate all their obligations in the eastern area, including the extraction wells. I suggest an additional Sentinel well on the other side of M14 in Scio Township. And then, as we talked about, they do have positive things, limited though, I would say. On site, they have 3 additional extraction wells, they got phyto remediation, and they got a heated soil vapor extraction system. So if I was on the site, I'd like this. But if I'm off the site, it doesn't really help me too much. Again, if you put the pieces of the puzzle together, this prohibition zone expansion, land use, institutional controls, and the municipal water contingency plan are all following their strategy of just simply expanding the prohibition zone, placing institutional controls on private property and taking of that private property, and providing the private property owner with a municipal water supply. And remember, they're only going to be paying for the installation. They're not going to be paying for operation and maintenance, increased taxes if this becomes a city property, on and on. What I have, after looking at this and rolling it around with the third consent judgment, I would say on balance, the current third consent judgment was simply updating the definitions to the current drinking water criteria and the groundwater surface water interface criteria is actually more protective of public health and the environment than this proposed fourth amended consent judgment. And as we know, the alternative that you have, in addition to going back and asking the court to simply update the groundwater surface water interface criteria and drinking water criteria and live with the third consent judgment, is looking at going towards a Superfund option. And EPA has stated that they would have active restoration of the aquifer that would extend the municipal water supply to any resident who may be potentially impacted, and then halt the dioxin plume from expanding. So, Jack, I think that's kind of the critique that GEA has been able to provide you all here.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate that,
Right.
all that information.
You're very welcome, Jim.
Roger?
Mute. Dan has to stop sharing his screen.
Here we go.
All right. So I'm going to show this 20-minute series of 4 short videos. Why am I commenting on this settlement proposal? Because I've been working on this for going on 28 years now as an unpaid citizen volunteer watching over this site, because I have a well. Money Creek runs behind my house. I used to work in the Parkland Plaza area, and I used to live in the city behind near Veterans Park. So it's like fate tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're it." Why do I have to do this as a citizen volunteer? Because in Scio, we don't have staff to do this. So I've tried to fill the void, and in the process of doing so, I've been co-founder and chair of Scio Residents for Safe Water, SRSW, and of CARD, the Coalition for Action on the Remediation of Dioxane. There are a slew of problems with this settlement proposal, most of which Dan Bicknell has pointed out. And there's several more that you will hear about in the coming weeks. So I'm going to show this 20-minute video that focuses on a couple of the seemingly good points from the settlement. And then it talks about inadequate purge rates and what could it mean for the plume expansion over the decades, or when Gelman decides enough cleanup has been done and walks away and nature takes back over. So I'll go ahead with this.
Time constraints that were put on us.
Let me back this up just a little.
I'm going to go through a couple of things that were good about the
audio is good.
proposed Gelman settlement. I'm going to go through rather quickly because we don't have a lot of time. The time constraints that were put on us are onerous, and apologize for having to zip through this, but that's what we're dealing with here. Very quick decision making. So this is the Gelman site. Now we're going to zoom in on the Gelman, the former Gelman property that's been split into these 4 parcels. And we're going to look at these high concentrations here at the core that haven't been remediated. And this is the plan for remediating some of those. This is the marshy area here. And then this is the, ponds 1 and 2, and this is the burn pit area. I'm going to highlight those, and we're going to go through each one. The ponds 1 and 2 is this area here. This is the area that they're going to focus on to remediate ponds 1 and 2. And yet, if we look at where ponds 1 and 2 are, this is pond 2. This doesn't even cover pond 2. We'll zoom in a little closer, you can see that. And here's where pond 1 was. This is the image that came from the EPA preliminary assessment in 2017. So you got pond 2 here and pond 1 here. And again, this area doesn't really encompass those 2 ponds. It gets part of pond 1 and maybe just a little piece of pond 2, according to the EPA's drawing. So I don't really trust that this pond remediation area is going to be effective if they're not encompassing where the ponds were actually located. Now we look at the burn pit area. This burn pit area, and here's some area here that's supposed to be, that's a covered area, sealed area. And this is where the burn pit was depicted as a couple times in the past when there are really high concentrations. And you can see that's outside of this area here. And it's under this covered area, so that it looks like they're not going to be remediating it. And there's some really high concentrations there, 220,000 parts per billion, 120,000 parts per billion, 584,000 parts per billion, 1,040,000 parts per billion. Now let's skip over to the area here in Pond 1 and 2 and MW5D, which is relatively shallow well. It's at the peripheral of this area that's supposed to be remediated. I'm not sure how effective it's going to be if it doesn't really encompass the whole MW5 area. Similarly for MW1 replacement, MW1 and its replacement, this is the hot spot that's in the core area that's been growing. And you can see these are pretty high concentrations, 4,000, 2,400, up to 4,000 parts per billion. And there's no remediation proposed for this deep area. This is deeper than what you're going to get with the remediation plans that they have in this area. There was another well that used to be there in W29, but that well was lost when the sewer line went in behind building 5. And you see that was already up to 2,000 parts per billion back in 92. What sewer line, you say? Well, this sewer line, this is the only image we have of it. And that was put in and apparently moved a lot of soil around. And some of that soil probably had some dioxin in it. So where did that soil end up? Is there still dioxin in it? Did it get moved to an area that hasn't been sampled properly? Here is where one of the early drain field, before they had the treatment ponds, they had a drain field behind building 1. And this is right in the area where MW29 was, which might explain those high concentrations we saw there. We're also concerned because there might be other things in there besides dioxin. We know, for instance, that they used to wash their circuit boards with TCE, and sometimes the TCE would just be dumped down the drain. And that might have been when this was active as a drain field. There was another 1 or 2 over by building 2. That same area where the drain field was for building 1 was also where the deep injection well was installed. And they had, I guess, you know, from the early investigations, there was some leakage at the surface. There's been a lot of sampling done of the soils around the area. And just looking at just the soil sample, he's taken away the regular well samples. This is where they were that we know about. A couple more up here. And then when these parcels were split back around 2015, there was baseline environmental analysis done where they did some soil samples. But the people doing the soil samples apparently didn't know about these high concentration soil samples that were done earlier, because where they sampled in these 4 places that we know about did not overlap with any of these really high concentration soil samples. So there could be a lot of dioxin in these other parcels that have already been split. So what it comes down to, we got these high concentrations in this area here. There's a high concentration here at MW5D that's not really shown. Let's look at the spray irrigation areas. So they had several spray irrigation area depictions, and we found a lot of these because of the EPA preliminary analysis, because they went into a lot of detail and showed us these spray irrigation areas that we didn't have some of these earlier. And one of them shows that not only spray irrigation here, but there was one over that same drain field and near where the deep injection well was. So there's three things that could have been contributing to this hotspot. That's where MW1 is and where MW29 used to be. So that's a concern. So here are the purge wells that are currently on the site. These are the ones that are not active in 2019. And these are the ones that are active in 2019. You notice they're not in the core hotspot here that would be ideal for getting the most dioxin out. And one of the reasons might be because might be other things here in this high concentrated core area besides dioxin that the company doesn't want to find. And if they did we think they did some sampling of that in the last several years that has not been made public. Here are the three locations that they're proposing to pump from on the first round of this new proposal. And you notice again, they don't hit any of these high concentration areas here around MW1. And then here's the 2 or 3 more locations that they would put in if the first 3 don't work. And again, it misses this bubble of high concentration. So what seemed to be a good idea to pump at the core, they miss the high area, the highest area of concentration, and makes us wonder what else is down there in that area. So that's the end of this segment.
Stay tuned.
Here we have the Gelman site showing the 2D map of the concentrations as of 2019. Here's the 3D version of that to show you the magnitude of those concentrations. We'll go back to the 2D and we zoom in. We have this hot spot here, just northeast of the First Sister Lake before Evergreen. This is an area that should be remediated. Also, this is the northern portion that's heading through Evergreen that currently doesn't have any remediation in it. So the company has proposed 2 remediation areas as part of this proposed settlement. The thing that's curious is that neither one of these attack the center of the high concentration. Here are the active purge wells in 2019. In the eastern area, there's only these 3, LB4 at Evergreen and TW 19 and TW 23 at Maple Road. These total together the purge rate 200 gallons a minute. Why is it 200 gallons a minute? So if you add up all of the purge wells in the eastern zone, they always total just under 200 gallons a minute, except for early periods where they were actually re-injecting a portion. But since about 2005, it's always been under 200 gallons a minute because that's all the pipeline can handle. This whole proposal is driven by a faulty assumption that they have to be constrained by the current pipeline, the one built back in 1999. I want to take a moment to point out these purge wells, LB1, 2, 3, and 4, that failed to capture and control the dioxane moving through Evergreen. So here we have a little slideshow of what's happened with extraction wells, LB1, LB2, LB3, and LB4. This is LB1. Started out low, got up to around 500 salt parts per billion, 510. Then LB2 overlapped a little bit with it, but a higher concentration, and then stopped and was replaced by LB3. And then LB4 came online to replace LB1. Now LB4 is the main purge well at Evergreen. But remember, there was LB3 before that, LB2 with even higher concentrations, and LB1 that kind of overran. So even with all of this, you can see that the trend line is pretty flat. Even with all of this, 20 years of pumping at Evergreen, they really haven't controlled the plume there, pumping at 200 gallons a minute. So that 200 gallons a minute is not enough capacity to stop what's going on in Evergreen or to stop what's going on with the E-plume. And now they want to have additional purge wells here, but they cannot put it in this pipeline without letting this other plume spread even more rapidly. So now they're proposing to take about 3 purge wells here, take the water out of this hot spot and maybe this hot spot, it's not clear, and then put it into the first sister lake. But putting that much water, 200 gallons per minute, into the first sister lake is likely to cause damage, even without considering all the dioxin that would be left from using a non-best available technology like ozone treatment that cannot trait to non-detect. And of course, you remember ozone, because of the naturally occurring bromide in the water, creates bromate in the effluent as well, a new carcinogen. And that's not going to be allowed under an PDS permit to put bromate and dioxane into the first sister lake, a pristine, naturally occurring lake, one of 2 in the city. They'll have to find some other way of disposing the purge water. There's nothing in this plan that couldn't be done under the current consent judgment. If this proposal is rejected, the current consent judgment stays into effect until another solution can be found, like going to the EPA to force a proper cleanup and get full cost recovery without giving up sovereignty. Here's what the concentrations are in this hotspot. MW100, in this hotspot, 465 DuPont, and MW77, several hundred parts per billion. Now, in the northwest portion here, MW121D is already up to about where the cleanup standard was in 95. It's already up to 3 parts per billion. Likewise, at MW129D. So this concentration here is moving north. And as it gets past 14, here are the township wells that could be affected as this dioxin moves through this area that doesn't have access to city water. Similarly, there's some Ann Arbor Township wells that could be affected. These are all in the pathway of any dioxin heading toward Barton Pond. So we have to stop the dioxin here. We can't let it even get close to Barton Pond because it could affect all the number of these scores of wells on the way to Barton Pond. Now here's some of the flow lines that we know exist in nature. These are where the groundwater flow will tend to go perpendicular to these lines. Here's a couple arrows that show where the possible flow could be from the site. And I've added this one because this one might follow along this tributary, just as the concentration of the western plume follows along this tributary. So if it gets underneath here, it may flow. It'll be under the surface until it gets down to where the land surface falls away. So there could be a lot of wells in this area that could be affected if this contamination is not stopped. Let's take a look at the purge rates in the average parts per billion going in and out of the system. So here's the flow rate in gallons per minute over the years. So they started out low and they got up to 800, 1200. And the concentrations were as high as 4,000 in the equalization pond, the red, so-called red pond. And then it fell gradually and it's kind of plateaued out over the years. And this is how much dioxane and the average they were releasing per year. So they're kept under 7 as permit required. This is using a UV oxidation, the best available technology. And they could actually get down to non-detect, so the average hovered around 1 part per billion in the last year of 2004. And that's when they were pumping about 1,100 gallons a minute at over 1,000 parts per billion. So let's take a look at what happened since. Whoa, it shot up to 5 parts per billion discharge. How could that be? They were having less parts per billion going in. They increased a little bit to around 1,200, but then it fell off in recent years. So what it is that after 2004, they switched to ozone oxidation. And the ozone oxidation, they can't treat to non-detect. So it bounced around 4 and 5 parts per billion. And then in recent years, it actually went up to between 5 and 6, even as the parts per billion going in went down, and a drastic reduction in the pumping rates. They're only pumping about 30% of what they were pumping at the peak. And yet they're discharging 5 parts per billion. And this was all done when it was 85 parts per billion cleanup standard. Now it's a 7.2 cleanup standard. This should be lower. And the only way you're going to get to that is go back to UV oxidation, which of course the company can do. The other subsidiary of Danaher is Trojan UV. They can treat down to below to non-detect, and they're doing that at several cities. So they could use their own technology and promote and develop the site and do a better job than what they're doing with the old technology.
Okay, I'm going to share another little image here that shows what the pumping rates have been over the years. So let me go back to share screen. I'm sorry, these are the total purge rates that you're going to see. So each one of these colors is a different purge well. So they were purging under 200 gallons a minute to start with, then it got up to 400, then that's 600, 800, 1,200. It was 1,200 for several years. And then they cut back to like 800, 600, and now they're doing around 400 or 500 total. As Dan Bicknell said, it's just under 500 now in recent. So this is what the purging looked like. But let's take a look at that in relation to all of the samples. What you see here is a mashup I've done in recent weeks of all 20,000 data samples using Tableau Public, a free application. There are links to this on srsw.org, so anybody can go in and do their own looking at data. But you can kind of see that there's hardly anything done in the Gelman era. This is kind of divided into 3 parts. This first section here is when it was Gelman Sciences. Then Paul took over in this period, and they did a pretty good job. They reduced a lot of mass. And then around 2010 or 11, they just kind of gave up. And then when Danaher took over in 2015, 16, they just continued that. And if you notice, that kind of matches the curve here. A lot of pumping in this section in here, removing a lot of mass, and then they cut back on their pumping, and not so much mass removal. And this proposal they put out just continues that. There's a lot of these, in the interactive version, you can click on just the extraction wells. You can see a lot of those extraction wells are just plateauing out, which means that the dioxin is still going somewhere. So you are being asked to approve a bad plan and lock all future township boards into that same bad plan. This proposal is written to benefit Gelman. Local governments are forbidden to request EPA intervention if they sign this settlement, thus taking the ability away from future board members and for the city council people and for the county commissioners. And that's just one of the poison pills that makes this proposal unacceptable. Gelman's cleanup budget seems to be driving the proposed solution, kind of like the capacity of the pipeline is driving what's going on in the eastern. And they've done all this without really defining what the problem is. They're throwing the solution out without telling you what the real problem is. And part of that, I think, is because they don't want people to know the real magnitude of the problem, maybe at the core. We've seen this over and over again, and that they're using basically last century static maps, kind of a hit and miss pumping without any real analysis behind it. The reporting has got some problems. And there's been some general sloppiness from time to time. It's less than best cleanup standards. It's less than best analysis method. It's less than best modeling. It's less than best reporting. It's less than best treatment. It's less than best transparency, as we've seen from this. Not even the people in the negotiations can release information that apparently was part of the negotiations. I asked Larry Lemke to please provide the data that was used for the final settlement. I asked him that a week before it was released, never heard back. And we have less than best due diligence. And we really need due diligence on this to match the scale of the problem. This is a Superfund sized site. And it's going to be a Superfund sized site for many years to come. It's just the question is, who do you want to be in charge of the Superfund enforcement of this site? Who do you want to be in charge to enforce the cleanup of this site? Do you want the polluter to be in charge, or do you want an entity that can actually make it happen? A lot of the images you see here are things I've done over the years as new techniques, visualization techniques come around. Since 2005, the Google Earth mashups, you've seen that in the stuff that I've presented, in the images that Dan's presented, and in the images the news releases. You'll notice in the proposal, in their images, they never show where the dioxin is. They don't show the problem, that their solution on those two-dimensional maps doesn't show you where the problem is, doesn't show you the scale of the problem, like I did in my presentation. And so the conclusion is this proposed Gelman dioxin settlement with an emphasis on settle. You don't have to settle for less than best on this, because we're all about 2/3 water. We need to act accordingly. There's no excuse to let this stuff go at the rate that the company wants it to go. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Roger. Okay, we will now open this up to anyone else in the audience that wishes to address us. Again, please use the raise hand feature and the *9 feature, which is raise hand on the telephones. and the clerk will recognize you one by one. Again, it's an individual time limit of 5 minutes, and we will let you know when there's about 30 seconds remaining.
Great. Bob Hyde.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Bob.
So thanks to Dan and Roger, you've seen these images and you've heard the presentations, just like I just did. They both describe the cleanup at the Gelman site as being a positive and limited. But beyond those words, keep the image that Roger showed about the areas that they're going to clean up. And I wanted to just talk about those. So they are going to be installing more wells, and they're going to be pumping. And Roger talked about that, and Dan talked about it. So I'm not going to. But the phytoremediation system and the heated soil vapor extraction system that they're going to put in are very limited. So what they're going to do is they're going to grow some trees, and they're going to plant trees, and they're going to draw water out and presumably dioxane with it. But as long as the trees keep growing, and as long as it can be determined that they're actually removing dioxane to be effective, they're going to keep it up. But the method of determining it isn't stated, and knowing how long it takes trees to mature, this system may be operated for decades with no assurance that much dioxane is going to be removed by it. So the thought that an EPA remedy is going to take a long time, so is this. And it's only going to be a shallow area because that's all that tree roots grow. And then they also have to put in and operate a heated soil vapor extraction system near, as Roger pointed out, the former burn pit. Such systems are discussed on EPA's website, and they could be as simple as buried electrodes to heat the soil with surface-mounted vapor recovery, or it can be drilled wells to inject steam and heat the soil with other wells to suck out the released vapor. But there's no requirement for the system design, no requirement for how deep the system is to function, and no requirement for how much dioxane is going to be removed. The defendant only needs to monitor the concentrations in the system's exhaust, and once it's no longer removing a meaningful amount, they're done. Then they are required to install an impervious cap over the ground. And that's pretty much admitting there will be so much dioxin remaining that we need to protect against rain leaching the contamination into the groundwater. So they get done with it, it's still contaminated. Okay, so I guess that's pretty much everything that I wanted to say. Just be very careful, because if you accept it, you're giving up all future actions, EPA included. So I hope you reject it.
Thank you, Bob. Next speaker is Bob Bailey.
Okay.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, my name is Bob Bailey, and I sent you some comments last week, but I simply want to, at the public meeting, urge you all to reject this proposed settlement, this modified consent judgment, without, certainly without having public information that's showing that it's likely that what they propose is really going to solve the issue, solve the problems. As Roger pointed out, their wells are not in the right place to clean up the core area, and they're sort of busy trying to get out of this as cheaply as possible. All of the goals are expressed as actions. That is, they'll pump in a well at Park Lake until it's not doing much, regardless of whether it has solved the problem or not. So I urge you to reject this amended consent judgment at this time. And yes, it's going to be a long time dealing with the legalities and pushing the state organization. And then, of course, if the EPA gets involved, it's going to take a long time, on the order of centuries, the way I see it, at least at the rate we're going, for this issue to be handled. And I think letting the company set some easy to reach goals where you grow trees for 30 years or something like that, and then they can walk away, is simply the wrong approach. But you need to reject this, and if this is the best that your lawyers can do, simply accepting Mike Caldwell's words that this is a good deal for us, I urge you to reject it, and we'll go back to the drawing boards and continue agitating for a full exploration of the issue and for treatments of various kinds, whatever is needed to actually solve the issue, so we don't have unacceptable amounts of dioxane moving out into the community forever. Well, for the next few hundred years. And yes, it's going to take a fair share of 100 years probably before this issue is really settled. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Next speaker is Elizabeth Collins.
Hi, thank you for having us this evening. I am in Ann Arbor, but I used to be in Scio prior to Gelman contaminating our wells. I live on the west side of First Sister Lake. And just to clarify something, the contingency plan for hooking up to municipal water only hooks them up to the water. The resident will have to pay for their sewer hookup, which can be pretty pricey unless something's changed. But that was how it was with all of us. We had to pay our own sewer hookup. So thank you to Dan and Roger for that great presentation. I just feel that this is still just such a non-transparent event that we're going through for the residents. For 3 weeks since this came out, I've been asking questions about this discharge into the nature area and the lake, and I'm getting no answers. I guess they'll all be answered on Thursday miraculously. It's very disheartening for those of us that watch this. And I mean, I would love this consent judgment to be something that we could all work with and accept. But as just a resident watching, and I am the Secretary of CARD, so I do go to all the meetings and I hear both sides of the issue. I just feel that there are too many clauses in this for them to exit out of the deal and for them to leave us with long-term problems. I really enjoyed the dog waste presentation. And I just kept thinking, like once caller already said, well, that's kind of, pertinent to what we're talking about. We're just putting carcinogens in though, with the bromate and the dioxane. So I don't know why it would be okay to put this into the non-detect First Sister Lake, which will go to Second Sister Lake, which has some Scio residents on wells. In fact, my neighbor, Carol Furtado, told me that she couldn't make it to speak tonight, but she lives at 505 Lakeview Avenue in Scio, and she would like everyone to know that she's very concerned. She has her wells tested, by the county every year, and it's just that biting your fingernails, wondering if this is the year that the dioxane will be in my water. So yeah, this is concerning because it's a City of Ann Arbor nature area. It's also a state and federal protected wetland, and they're the only glacier-made natural lakes in this area. So I really, and like Dan Bicknell said, getting the NPDES permit is questionable. I have a feeling that this has been tried before in the past, and that's one of my questions I'm trying to get answered, that it has been discussed before and was denied. So basically, if you accept this plan, know that all that dioxane they're saying they're going to remove from the park lake possibly will not even be allowed to be removed. Yeah, I've been keeping track of how many residents have spoke in favor of this, and so far I haven't heard any at the Eagle meeting last Monday and so far tonight. So I'm going to keep track with all these meetings, and maybe we could, I'll email you. Oh, thank you for, hopefully you looked at the pictures I sent yesterday of what the wetlands, the former wetlands at the Honey Creek discharge area looked like, because that's very concerning that we're just allowing the polluter to do this. So anyway, thank you for your time. I will let other people speak.
Thank you, Elizabeth. The next speaker is Carol, and after that, it will be Rita Mitchell. Carrie, excuse me, Carrie. Carrie? Okay, oh, there you are, Carrie. Hi. Carrie, we can't hear you. You appear to be unmuted. I'm going to move on for a moment to Rita Mitchell. Rita?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Rita.
Hi, thank you. I'm Rita Mitchell. I'm actually a resident of Ann Arbor, and one of many people who've been following the Gelman plume issue for a long time. I want to just acknowledge that we as a community are really fortunate to have people with the persistence and technical knowledge that are contributed by Dan Bicknell and Roger Rail and others who followed this for a long time. Their information is really helping us look at the consent judgment that's you're considering now in the name of the people who elected you to your positions. And I think it would be difficult to assess the consent judgment without that additional kind of technical view that they provide. I'm speaking tonight in opposition of the fourth consent judgment regarding the settlement of Gelman and the Scio Township, and I hope that I'm asking you to reject the consent judgment. My reasons, something that Roger mentioned, water is life, water is part of us. It's the core of the issue that people in the city of Ann Arbor, in Scio Township and Washtenaw County have been fighting to maintain as clean for all these years since the 1,4-dioxane pollution was identified. The Gelman Company caused harm to the people, wildlife, and ecosystems surrounding its now closed plant. Its actions have resulted in delay and expansion of the risk of exposure to thousands of people. More recently, the ongoing delay and reduction in the volume of treatment over time that while Gelman has had access to state-of-the-art water treatment methods that it didn't use, allowed further expansion of the plume. I'm not sure why we would trust them to continue. The consent judgment states that the lawsuit against the Gelman Company is dismissed with prejudice. I looked it up. I'm not a lawyer, but it means that this is a final decision and that you as trustees, as well as the future elected officials for the township, are forbidden from filing another lawsuit based on the same grounds. If you accept this consent judgment and actions for treatment proceed as described in the documents, and you later find that the outcome is unacceptable, you won't be able to return to court for further redress from the polluter. So in the interest of public health and safety of those that you are elected to represent, you shouldn't give up the option for future action against the Gelman Company. I don't see it in this consent judgment. The compromises seem all too one-sided. They're focused on termination of treatment of polluted water and to get Gelman out of the process. The people of Scio Township should have clean, fresh, safe water, ideally from their local wells, as is the usual practice for township members. Safety in their homes is something that the people of Scio Township should also have, and on their property from exposure to vapor intrusion or ground transmission of water, this water-soluble compound. So what does the Gelman Company want? They want their money and to forget the polluting actions that they caused to take place 40 years ago or over 40 years. They want to reclaim their time to focus on other actions that can provide them with more money. They want to terminate their responsibility to clean up the pollution as soon as possible. The fourth consent judgment would result in prohibition from asking for assistance from the EPA. I don't think you should give up that option. It would also result in loss of control of wetland management, allowing for Gelman to work without mitigating damage to changes in the wetlands. And it would add dioxin to First Sister Lake. You've heard that. It's a protected area. I can't even imagine why Eagle would allow that. The potential is also there for disagreements over installation and payment for access to potable water and its infrastructure for those homeowners who would be required to get their water from another source than from a well. So the consent judgment doesn't provide adequate additional remediation of the pollution. Please reject the consent judgment and petition Governor Whitmer to apply to the EPA for remediation.
30 seconds.
The case before you has a known responsible party, the Gelman Company, which should pay the cost of the pollution and the cost it could have borne a long time ago and at less expense than it is potential now due to the extended delays in treatment. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Rita.
Thank you, Rita.
The next speaker is Alexander Weinstein. Alexander.
Yes, hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for this event tonight and hearing us, and thanks to Dan and Roger. I am a resident of Scio Township at 523 Lakeview Avenue. I live right on Second Sister Lake, and my well is one of those wells that would be affected by this settlement. I'm asking you to reject this settlement for all of the reasons that have been given. I think they have been so excellently outlined. The settlement is just unbelievably unacceptable. It's an environmental disaster that the polluter is clearly trying to avoid full responsibility for. And furthermore, get out of any future responsibility for the damage and potential deaths or poisoning of citizens. And it kind of blows my mind. It shouldn't in this day and age, of course, where corporations sometimes overwhelm the voice or the rights of people. But it still shocks me that this is what is trying to be passed right now. I'm a homeowner with children, and 4 children that play in the lake here. And I'm not alone. There's many children that play in the lake. The Park Lake pump that's being suggested, the well, would by design pump carcinogens into the lake where my children play, where I swim. Every year when the water test comes through, I am so thankful to know that my water does not have dioxin yet in it, that the lake doesn't, that I can tell my children that it's okay to swim in there. Never mind the wildlife and the wetlands that would be affected by this. And so that part is horrifying to me. And for that alone, I would ask to reject this. But the ability for the company to get out of their responsibility for the damage they've done is deeply unethical. And it directly hurts and endangers all of the citizens that are going to be affected, that are affected now, and that would be affected by the spread as it's clearly moving and would not be helped by this. So again, I just ask that you reject this and support all of the voices against it tonight and the suggestions here for deeper action to be taken. And I thank you for your time and hopefully your rejection of this.
Thank you, Alexander. The next speaker is Jeff Hayner. Jeff.
Hi, thanks for taking my comments, and I wanted to say hello to all my colleagues and counterparts over there in Scio Township. And I also wanted to give a big thanks to Dan Bicknell for so succinctly and thoroughly summarizing the problems that exist with this consent judgment. It's a real dog, and I think we can all see that it's not an improvement. It's not progress, and I'm disappointed. I'm sure I'm as disappointed with this as anybody here around your table. I tried as a group. We intervened. And as a person, I tried to intervene and force myself into some of these negotiation sessions. Sit there, Kathy and I went to some and see just what was going on. And I never felt, honestly, like I had a real grip on what was happening in that room or had a real say. And that's all I'll say about that. But I'm very disappointed in the outcome of those conversations. And I don't know how many opportunities we're going to get to speak between now and when it each comes up for a vote. But I'm urging you all to reach out and let's share some correspondence amongst ourselves and see if we can come to a conclusion on this. I think it's a real dog, and I like the suggestion that Mr. Bicknell had, that we may be better off in a situation and saying carry on where we are, and let's take this to a higher authority. Everything about this is just wrong. It's just letting the polluter off the hook. And it seems like we had no hand in this deal, to paraphrase a popular TV show from before. It really seems like we had no real say in this. As the victims of this pollution, they're a bad corporate actor, and they continue to be a bad corporate actor. And I'm going to reject this. I'm going to urge you guys to really seriously consider doing the same. And so thank you for setting this up for us tonight to listen. And one of the callers said that she hadn't heard a positive comment from anybody. I have not received a positive comment, either in person or the phone or an email, from anybody. Anybody who reads into this or delves into it at all is saying the same thing that I think we're all thinking sitting here. And so I'm sorry it's come to this, but I appreciate you creating this opportunity for public awareness and taking some time. And I look forward to seeing you folks on Thursday. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Any other hands? I still see a hand from Carrie. And your mic is off, Carrie. Okay, we're going to move on to the next person, Jackie Curto. Jackie, can you unmute yourself? There you go.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank the trustees for offering this opportunity for feedback, and to thank Mr. Bicknell and Mr. Rail for their very compelling analysis and calculations, and really, truly deep gratitude to them for their incredible dedication and time they've devoted to the Gelman cause over the years. Also to Ms. Nolan, Ms. Green, for your work on this issue. I know you've attended many of these hearings as well, and thank you for representing Scio. I just want to quickly echo the previous speakers for their compelling arguments and urge you to vote against this revised consent judgment and reject the settlement agreement. And then I have a few questions that I wanted to raise perhaps for the meeting on Thursday. And one of those is, what will Eagle do with the comments that had to be submitted by yesterday? And unfortunately, that was before we had this session today. But is there a possibility that there will be any revisions to this consent judgment? Is this process still ongoing, or is this what we have and this is it? I was really concerned about the lack of consequences for having to expand the prohibition zone. And I just wonder why Eagle would support expanding the prohibition zone rather than requiring an increase in the groundwater treatment so that the standards are met. It doesn't seem to me that expanding the prohibition zone really constitutes remediation in any sense of the word. Taking away the ability to use our wells is a major imposition for many Scio citizens, and it doesn't seem that simply commanding that to be so is adequate remediation. I'm concerned, as others have pointed out, about the lack of performance standards for the phytoremediation and the soil treatment at the Gelman site. Those of you who know me know I love trees. I'm all in favor of planting more trees, but simply to say we're going to plant some trees and not have any real way to measure the success of that as remediation does not feel like it's adequate. And I do want to echo the concerns expressed about the lack of more rigorous treatment targeted to the most contaminated areas, and why is Gelman not showing that their treatment is in the most contaminated zones? And then finally, I'm wondering about the provisions about the groundwater surface water interchange. It doesn't appear that they offer any true protection to the Huron River. It seems very likely, in fact, that dioxane will be migrating into the Huron River in the near future. Finally, I just feel that discharging to First Sister Lake is not acceptable for reasons that I think Elizabeth Collins and others have described very well earlier. I guess I'm left with the question of what do we do? My understanding is that the Superfund program will not fund cleanup of sites at which there is a currently operating company overseeing the cleanup, and that is at least what we have been told in other meetings. While the Superfund or CERCLA cleanup requirements are certainly more rigorous than those in the fourth consent judgment, they could also be subject to political whims in the administration of the program. And I wonder whether there would be any real accountability if a federal agency were overseeing this rather than us having some local input. However, whatever challenges there might be in pursuing future Superfund status, the fact that this settlement prevents Scio from ever seeking EPA intervention in the future is alone enough to make me believe that this is a bad agreement and to urge you all not to sign it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Other hands. I've got a phone number here.
Carrie.
Hello, 734 ending in 464. Would you like to speak? You can unmute yourself by pressing *6. *6. You can also unraise your hand by pressing *9. Let me know if you'd like to speak. Carrie, or the phone number ending in 464. And then Carrie Letke, would you like to speak?
I just unmuted. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay,
Welcome.
finally, third time. I'll keep this brief because I'm pretty much along the same sentiment as everyone else who's spoken so well before. But to state my name is Carrie Letke. I'm Vice President of Walnut Ridge, and I'm basically representing many homeowners who wanted their collective concerns to this proposed amended consent judgment. I will basically defer to and agree with the experts who spoke so well before and thank them for all of their time on educating us and the amount of effort they've consistently put into this. I guess the main strong concern that I will just follow up with is just the future rights of the township agreeing to not sue for any claims or concerns that may arise. I mean, we haven't predicted much of this so far, so how are we certain to predict what could potentially happen in the future and then just wash our hands of just letting them be okay with not having to be responsible or accountable for any of it? We don't want the current board to have to make such a big decision that would compromise future boards' abilities to handle these situations in the future. We should really hold fast to our convictions and not accept something that's mildly good, and that's the best they could bring to us, when it's really not even good enough at all. This judgment doesn't seem to have a lot in our favor and is a lot of trade-offs and asking more from us than we are asking of them to clean up what they have done and left in our lap. We should be concerned of future contamination of chemicals that we may not even know about that could interact, and we shouldn't be barred from remedying this. We've talked a lot about land preservation in the recent weeks and the recent meetings. Parks and pathways, we have great plans for this township, so we clearly value our land. Why would we not value it now when really there's a lot more at stake? But I know these meetings last long. I just wanted to give you that little bit, and I thank you for the time and the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Carrie. I'd like to go to the phone number ending in 464. Welcome.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Who are we speaking to?
Okay, thank you. My name is Linda Brower, and I'm a longtime resident of Ann Arbor. I listened to I was zooming into the whole presentation, so I saw Roger Rails and Dan Bicknell's presentations and all the comments, but my connection was so bad, I just dialed in order to be able to speak. So thank you so much. Although I live in Ann Arbor, I'm calling in because, as you know, this topic affects all of us. We're all in this together, Scio Township, the city of Ann Arbor, the other surrounding townships. So thank you for giving even people outside of Scio a chance to speak tonight. The Fourth Amended consent judgment and the settlement agreements are extremely disappointing. After years of negotiations and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, the interveners may be tempted to acquiesce to a totally unsatisfactory agreement out of utter exhaustion. Please don't acquiesce. You may be tempted to acquiesce because of the years and legal fees invested into this consent judgment to date. You made a good faith attempt to intervene. Unfortunately, your good faith was not reciprocated by Gelman Sciences. It's time to cut our losses and recognize that we're not negotiating with a good faith partner. The best that can be said about Gelman Sciences is that they have amazing attorneys. As it stands, the amended consent judgment requires relatively little from the polluter, and the settlement agreements require the four intervening jurisdictions to give up virtually all our rights in the matter in perpetuity in exchange for very little. In the event any of the local governments invoke the dispute resolution procedures, final decisions are left up to EGLE. And with regard to termination of post-termination monitoring, EGLE shall consult with the local governments and consider in good faith their comments and concerns. With all due respect to individual employees of EGLE, and I believe they are hardworking and most of them are trying to act in good faith, EGLE as an institution has not inspired trust in its handling of the Gelman toxic plume since it was discovered in 1984. The phrase, "will consider in good faith the concerns of local governments," is vague and virtually meaningless to the extent of embarrassment. As a resident living at the edge of the plume and drinking from the Huron River, I support a position to the U.S. EPA to put this site on the national priorities list as a polluter pays Superfund site. That's really not that risky since there's a known responsible polluter with the funds and the technology to do the fullest cleanup possible. And U.S. EPA has the authority to enforce compliance. There's no risk because there is no need to rely on federal dollars. I think there's been a lot of fear-mongering, or a certain amount of fear-mongering about going to the U.S. EPA route on two counts, that it will take decades and produce stigma. In my view, the stigma of our communities in the state having let the plume expand as far as it has over decades, with very little political will to contain and clean it up, and ultimately failing, is a far worse stigma than being listed as a Superfund site that is on the road to a near complete cleanup. Yes, it may take time. That's why we must start the process now. We just spent over 3 years in hopeful but secret negotiations that resulted in a plan that gives Gelman all the power to decide when its role is complete and allows Gelman to utilize the cheapest technology, and so that EGLE will resolve any disputes after considering local government's concerns in toothless good faith. Let's not waste any more time. As an affected resident, I am unwilling to give up my future rights in this matter by accepting this new consent judgment and settlement agreement. I'm willing to petition the U.S. EPA for Superfund status and wait for a proper cleanup paid for by the polluter who has the ability to pay. The polluter has the ability but not the will to pay. We need the U.S. EPA to help the polluter find the will. I urge you to follow the example of Ann Arbor Township and vote to reject this consent judgment and settlement agreement. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Jillian Carey. Hi, Jillian.
Hi. I'm going to read something here for everybody. Water touches every person on the planet every single day. As the world's population increases, so too does the demand for this precious resource. The world's supply of clean water is under substantial stress due to industrialization, increasing demand, rising biological and chemical contamination, amongst other factors. This stress represents a significant threat to world health, our environment, and current and future generations around the globe. We enable customers to meet their water quality objectives by providing eco-efficient solutions that reduce and recover costs, energy, resources, and space. Collaboratively, solving problems with our customers, we deliver low-risk, innovative technologies that offer sustainable results. We ensure greater water confidence and environmental stewardship for people and industries and municipalities, improving the lives of over 1 billion people globally. This is directly from Trojan Technologies, which is a subsidiary of Danaher Corporation. I don't understand how Danaher can create a settlement that benefits them and not our environment, our community. If we settle for this agreement, we are settling for Danaher not to live up to their own vision and value statements. We get the short end of this. So we can, as a community, hold them accountable for who they are and what they stand for in this world. I reject the settlement, and I really urge everybody listening that has power to reject it as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jillian. Any other hands? Would any other members of the public like to speak? You can raise your Zoom hand. If you're having trouble with that, just unmute yourself or type a message in the chat if you're having trouble. I don't see any other hands. I did see one hand from somebody named Carrie, but she was unable to participate. Carrie with the lower C, if you'd like to participate, please do so. I see no other interested public.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we will end the public comment section, session then. We'll go to action items.